Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this launch of David Roodman's book. I'm going to hold it up. As I understand, you can get copies afterwards. Due Diligence, an Impertinent Inquiry into Microfinance. I know many of you are from the microfinance community. I'm Nancy Birdsall, the president of the Center for Global Development. I know many of you are from the microfinance community, so I don't want to say too much about what's in this book because I'm sure that at least some of you over the last year and a half or more have been reading and commenting through David's blog posts on the work that he's doing, which is now brought together in this wonderful book. I just want to take this chance to say how exciting it is for us at the center to have this work of David Roodman completed, partly because it took a long time to complete, but partly because it is in many ways the product of an unbelievably interesting and substantive and deep conversation that he's had with many of you who are in the room. So it's especially nice to see the crowd today. I also want to say that everything that I know about microfinance, virtually everything I know about microfinance, I've learned from David Roodman and from Michael Schlein, who will be on the panel and who will be formally introduced in a few moments. What I've learned from Michael Schlein, I learned because I had the great privilege. I was asked by Maria Otero just before she abandoned Acción if I would be on the board there. And that has really opened my eyes to many issues in microfinance that I was simultaneously learning about by following David's blog. I just want to also say that because it has been a while since I looked at David's blog posts, I turned at his suggestion to chapter 7, and it reminded me what a wonderful book this is. For any of you who haven't read it in its earlier blog versions, you are really in for a treat. So it's probably not kosher to advertise the book this way by the head of the center before the panel, but there it is. Now, let me say a word about David Roodman. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. He was one of the first people that I had the great opportunity to hire because I had read a book that he did at the World Watch Institute in the late 90s on the debt situation. And at the founding of the Center for Global Development, one of the issues we were looking at, and I was looking at myself, was the debt burden of the poorest countries. Many of you will also know that, so he's an expert on debt. He has continued that work. We released a paper of his about a year ago, and he's still thinking about debt all the time, and it clearly influenced the approach that he took and has taken to the microfinance issues. He is also the chief architect of this Commitment to Development Index, and through that work he has exploited, and we as an institution have been able to exploit, his extraordinary mathematical and statistical and econometric abilities. He was listed on the Review of Economic Papers, something or other REPIC, as one of 10 top young economists. He tells me he may fall off that list soon. I think it's because he is advancing in age, not because there are 10 other more top young economists. He spent time on a Fulbright in Vietnam many years ago, so he's been in the field as well. And on the last line of his long bio that I'm looking at, it says, it's not a surprise for me, but it probably would be a surprise for many of you who have followed David's work, he has never taken a course in economics or statistics. I think you must have taken one in economics at the CGD, no? So with all of that, it's a great pleasure to introduce our author of the day, David Roodman. I didn't follow my instructions. I am now to introduce Rewa Misra, who's the program manager at the MasterCard Foundation, one of our partners in producing a book and this event, along with CGAP, another partner. Let me introduce Riwa, who has something to say, and welcome to you.
Thank you, Nancy, for that introduction. My name is Reva Mishra. I'm working with the MasterCard Foundation. I'd like to start off by thanking both the Center for Global Development and the Consultative Group to Assist the Poorest, both for their partnership with the MasterCard Foundation on this important endeavor, and also give you a brief introduction about the MasterCard Foundation for those of you who are not too familiar with our work. We work mostly in two areas, that's youth learning and promoting financial inclusion. And we're partnering currently in around 48 countries with partners in these two areas. We're a private foundation started up, in 2006 when MasterCard Worldwide went public. And a lot of our work is really about enabling people living in poverty largely in sub-Saharan Africa to learn and prosper through the provision of education services and through financial inclusion. So in 2010, we partnered with the CGD and CGAP within sort of a part of a broader effort at our level to share learning in the field of microfinance with the broader public. And I think that the intent and enterprise of David Roodman's book was a really unique contribution and a unique way of achieving that objective. And over time, we've seen that increasing sort of conversation around this book, increasing blogs, increasing tweets, a lot of response coming from the broader public, from key stakeholders in microfinance. And while the views expressed in the book are not always necessarily those of the MasterCard Foundation, I think that the spirit with which the book was written, the intent of bridging rhetoric and reality around microfinance is certainly echoed by us. I would like to congratulate CGD and David for the completion of this tremendous enterprise, and wish you all the best for the future.
Wow. It's really great to be here. This project began 4 years ago, 7 years ago, 10 years ago. The countdown to this launch has been going for a long time. And you can imagine it's really a thrill for me to be here now. To paraphrase the philosopher Sam Cooke, I don't know much about theology, but I do know that story from the Old Testament about King Solomon. You probably all know it as well. Two women come to him claiming the same child as their own. And he says, well, he asks for a sword to be brought to him. And he says he's going to slice the child down the middle and give half to each woman. The false mother thinks this is a great idea. And the true mother, of course, immediately gives up her claim on the child in order to save the child. And so then Solomon gives the child to the rightful mother because she's the one who's passed the test. As I've mentioned once or twice on the blog and in the book, I'm a child of divorce. And if you've ever experienced a custody dispute, and I'm sure some of you have, I'll bet this story of King Solomon has come to mind. I'm not certain, but I think at various times both of my parents invoked it and saw themselves in the rightful mother. And so something I realized reflecting on the book just this week is that being the powerless child in that story can make you grow up to be a bit like the powerful King Solomon. You can move to the top of that diamond. At least it did in my case. And I don't mean to be pretentious about this. I'm just saying that the way I grew up does affect the way that I think. I had two parents whose views on certain very important and personal things just fundamentally conflicted, and I couldn't reconcile it. But I couldn't give up on the idea that both of my parents had something to offer and had some piece of the truth. And I think it leads me, or at least has strengthened this tendency in myself to really want to think through complicated problems, to hear all sides, on the presumption that all sides have some insight to offer, to look for evidence, ask tough questions about what evidence stands up, what arguments make sense, and then eventually reach a judgment. I think it helps explain why I'm generally a patient listener, but can lose patience, as you may have seen a few times on my blog, with those who are quick to condemn other people and other people's ideas. Now, like all strong personality characteristics, this habit of mine can be a strength and a weakness, and sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other. And which it is depends on the context. And so I think part of the art, or maybe the luck of life, is finding a position for yourself where what is most unusual about you is most often a strength. And I'm truly grateful to have found such a position at CGD, and thankful to Nancy for having taken a risk on me 10 years ago. I also want to thank the MasterCard Foundation. As Ray was said, they don't have to endorse should not be seen as endorsing every word that I've written, but I very much appreciate the spirit with which they have supported this in the spirit of public discussion and debate. And I should explain a bit. What this is about, but I want to really thank CGAP. The MasterCard Foundation is a Canadian foundation. Legally, they could not grant directly to us. And so they hit upon the idea of granting through CGAP, which is legally part of the World Bank and is an international institution. And so they are formally granting to CGAP, which is granting to us. But it has been far more, CGAP is serving as far more than a conduit. They've been fantastic partners, and I really appreciate their help, especially Jeanette Thomas here in the audience. So, having gathered all the evidence on the impacts of microfinance and poured acid on everything to see what passes the test and heard all the arguments, I have, in all my Solomonic wisdom, reached a couple of major conclusions. And I'm glad most of you are sitting down because they may come as something of a shock. First is, microcredit is not a silver bullet against poverty. I know that's a real shock, but someone had to tell you, right? Okay, I hope you've recovered from that one, because here's another one. Microcredit is a kind of credit. And in general, we know that credit is sometimes very useful and sometimes gets people into trouble. Sometimes credit markets go crazy. But at the same time, we know that pretty much at every economic stratum, credit is essential. And all those things go for credit and therefore go for microcredit too. Who would have thought of that? Seriously, since I started writing this book 4 years ago, the pendulum of public opinion has swung against microfinance, and it's now become a bit of a cliche that microfinance, after all, is not a cure for poverty. And like all cliches, it contains some truth, but it's also, I think, getting a bit tiresome. The harshest attacks on microfinance, I think, made the same mistake as the hype originally did, which is the presumption that the truth is simple. There are pure truths in physics and in mathematics, but rarely at the social level. So I think that whatever contribution I have made through the book and through the blog to understanding the impacts of microfinance have come from my being what it is in me to be, to hear all sides and think things through. So my book is an act of investigation, synthesis, pedagogy, judgment, and advice. I claim little originality for most of the ideas that are in the book, but there are more. I look at microfinance from more perspectives than ever before in one place, and I think that does bring a kind of insight. My real conclusions, which I will get to, are hardly radical, but they are important, or the ideas they represent are important, and I think I've put them on a firmer foundation. And I think the way that I've gone about doing this, although I didn't foresee this, provides a model for spheres beyond microfinance. The question of what does this large class of interventions that we call microfinance, what are its impacts? And the way I've approached answering that question, I think could be used in other areas. And so there's something broader here about how we do evaluation in development. And I'm going to expand on that for the rest of my talk by way of giving you a tour of the book. And since the book is all about words, I'm going to give you that tour with pictures. Chapter 2 looks at microfinance from the perspective of clients. I think that's the best place to start. It turns out that poor people need financial services more than you and I do, who I would consider part of the global rich. And that's because most poor people, which is to say most people, live lives of relative risks. They don't have salaries. So not only are their incomes low, but they're volatile and unpredictable. They tend to be more vulnerable to illness and injury, and more likely to lose work when they are sick or otherwise disabled, because their job require their physical health. And so they all need ways to put aside money on good days and in good seasons and to draw it out in bad. And they need ways to discipline themselves or nudge themselves into doing so. And all financial services help with this basic task, whether it's credit or savings, insurance, money transfers, often imperfectly. But in this view, what microfinance is a set of new options for poor people, in addition to the ones that they already have for managing money, that is useful in the spirit of diversification. And that is why the book Portfolios of the Poor has that title. One of the authors was going to be here today, Daryl Collins, but unfortunately she had a child who's taken a bit sick, who's okay, but she couldn't come. Chapters 3 and 4 bring us the perspective of history. As you can see, Muhammad Yunus was not the first do-gooder to try to help the poor through financial services. I see him as a kind of Henry Ford figure. He didn't invent microfinance. In fact, modern microfinance in all its forms descends directly from the German credit cooperatives of the 1850s, and I document the family tree in the book. But he was the first in the modern wave to mass produce financial services for the masses, to bring them to thousands or to millions. And I think that is actually part of his true contribution. And the comparison to Henry Ford is apt. Chapter 5 looks at microfinance from the point of view of the people who actually do it every day. The managers of MFIs is microfinance institutions. The managers and the staff, these are some guys I met in Alexandria. They're loan officers. It turns out that, whoops, sorry. Okay. It turns out that, according to some statistics in my book, let me see if I can find it here. As of 2009, the average microcredit client got his or her loan from an institution with 2.2 million borrowers, 9,000 employees, $730 million in assets, and operating profits equal to 16% of revenue. Most microfinance is produced and delivered by macro institutions. And the big institutions got that way by solving a very tough business problem, which is how to mass produce financial services on a small scale for poor people without losing your shirt. And so we can look at big microfinance institutions the way that Darwin looked at finches in the Galapagos. There's a connection between how they operate and why they manage to survive and indeed thrive. It turns out, in fact, that some of the characteristics that microfinance is most known for, groups, loans, focusing on women, can be explained in the Darwinian perspective. The group mechanism, for example, delegates part of what is traditionally a banker's responsibility onto the clients. They take on the job of deciding who's a good risk and who should be allowed to join the group, and they also apply pressure for repayment. And to the extent that we can explain why microfinance is the way it is from this evolutionary perspective, then we should be a little bit more skeptical of arguments or claims that microfinance is the way it is because that's what's best for clients. And I don't mean that as a harsh criticism. Evolutionary imperatives cannot be gotten around. They are part of the reality in which we must work. I also look at microfinance from the academic perspective, although actually there are many academic perspectives. And the ones that I'm most interested in are the ones that are used to evaluate microfinance, to judge what its impacts are. And that actually kind of brings me to the second half of the book, which is a more evaluative in its stance. The kind of evidence that tends to dominate the discussions of the impacts of microfinance is the number crunching studies. And when I started my book, this was the most influential one. This one was by these guys here, Mark Pitt and Shahid Kankar. It found that in Bangladesh in the early 1990s, microcredit did reduce poverty, meaning household spending went up, especially when given to women. But it's really hard to understand, even for a mathematician like me. And not long after it came out, it was disputed by Jonathan Morduch, who has since literally written the book on the economics of microfinance. So one thing I did when I started this book project was I decided I want to replicate the study. I want to rerun the numbers so I can actually put that study in my computer and see if I believe it and understand what's going on. And actually just last month, Jonathan and I put out a paper arguing that we're even more confident now that this study should not be relied upon, that it just doesn't demonstrate cause and effect. That helps reconcile it with newer studies that you've probably heard about, which are randomized and have generally found that, at least within short time frames, 12 to 18 months, microcredit is not reducing poverty. Now, the reason I told you about this is in part there's a story attached to this. While I was crunching all these numbers, I had to try to understand math like this, which is not easy even for me, and write computer code like this. I had a chance to visit some microcredit programs in Egypt, in Cairo. And so I went on disbursement day to a branch of the LEAD Foundation, and this is the lobby. All these women are waiting to get their loans, and the crowd actually overflowed into the hallway, down the stairs, and onto the street. They were waiting hours. They were very excited. I got to meet a few of the clients in a group of 5, in the presence of their loan officer, I should emphasize, and they told me what they were going to use the microcredit for. Aniyat was going to sell bed sheets, Samo was buying and selling clothing, and so on. Now, I didn't take this literally because I knew they were speaking in front of their loan officer, and they probably had to say that they were using the money for some kind of micro enterprise. But it did seem to me that something good was going on here. Maybe not perfectly good, but they were there voluntarily. They seemed to be grasping at something to get a modicum of control over their lives. Here's some loan officers at that place. And I thought, should I tell them that back in my hotel on my laptop I've been running conditional recursive mixed process regressions using the maximum likelihood method on cross-sectional data from household surveys in Bangladesh in the early 1990s, and I'm not so sure that we should be taking those loans? Maybe it's not a good idea. I mean, who was I to tell them how to live their lives I don't really understand? And yet I do deeply believe in the importance of good evaluation and the importance of judging which evaluations to rely on and which not. So I felt that I'd hit a paradox. And over the next few months, I found a way to deal with that became the heart of the book, and it is the basis for chapters 6 and 7 and 8. I realized that in the microfinance movement, in this global conversation, there are at least 3 distinct conceptions of success, and they correspond with definitions of the word development. At least it maps that way in English. One of those is development as escape from poverty, the idea that microfinance is going to lift everybody up. As I've just suggested to you, there really isn't the evidence for that. The best studies, the randomized ones, just are not showing that, at least over short time periods. But there are other definitions. And I should say, I don't think we should expect microcredit to lift people out of poverty. It's just not common sense. It's not why I'm standing here a rich person. My family did not get me to where I am through microcredit. But there are other conceptions that I think are important and need to be thought through. One of those is development as freedom. This is, of course, taken from the title of a book by Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize-winning economist. Sen argues that the essence of development is expanding control, expanding agency in one's life, freedom. And freedom comes in many forms. Income can be a source of freedom because it gives you more purchasing power in the market. Education can be, the right to vote, human rights, civil rights. And freedoms tend to support one another, so that democracy in India prevented famine there, Sen argues. And income can lead to more education, which can lead to more income. And that means that individual freedoms are both means and ends. Microfinance can be seen as a way of giving people more control over their finances, as I've already suggested. And I within this framework here, this is where I put the work of Stuart Rutherford, author of The Poor and Their Money, and a key author of Portfolios of the Poor. If you read those works, there's no argument that microfinance is lifting people out of poverty, but it does seem that microfinance services are useful tools for people who are trying to just get by and manage their lives a bit better. So I see it as kind of like clean water, electricity. We don't expect those to lift people out of poverty, but they can be useful services, not without problems. Also within this frame and dealt with in chapter 7 are questions of when is credit usury? When is it leading to what we might call the debt trap or debt enslavement? And I also probe into the question using drawing from anthropological studies of when groups are sources of peer support and when they're ought to be seen in a more negative light, when they're sources of peer pressure that actually limit women's agency in their lives. And I have to say, for group credit, which is the most famous kind, the balance is, if anything, negative. There are a lot of worrisome stories about women who can't pay, and so their peers, who don't want to pay on their behalf, come to their house and take away their roofs or their pots and pans. I'm not saying that happens in the majority of cases, but it's still a worrisome thing, and it's not part of the standard microfinance narrative. The third and last conception of success is development as industry building. If I were being more wonkish, I might say development as transformation. This is the idea most associated in economics with Joseph Schumpeter, who coined the term, actually he didn't coin it, but he popularized it, creative destruction. The idea is that in the sweep of history, what has most reduced poverty is industrialization, this process of constant churning, creation of new firms, new technologies, new ways of making old goods and services and new goods and services. Not to say that government has no role in alleviating the harmful effects of industrialization, but that has been the core driver. If you come to microfinance with this perspective about what development is, I think you'll conclude that microfinance is not turning its clients into Schumpeterian heroes of creative destruction. People who sell more vegetables don't disrupt the status quo. But the institutions that have been created, the Grameen banks of the world, in Bolivia and many other countries where microfinance has matured, they are competing, they're innovating, they are hiring thousands, and they are serving millions, and those millions tend to be pretty poor and deserving people. That's a pretty impressive success. Again, there's room for critique. We've seen most spectacularly in India that that the microfinance can go awry, especially when it grows too fast, and then that would be an example of a failure from the perspective of development as industry building, where we've seen a kind of overshoot and crash. I think I have and that leads to this broad question of when is creative destruction more creative than destructive, which is what we want. I have a graph, just a little bit of data. This is the number of loans outstanding in 3 countries that have had what appear in some respects to have been bubbles, and you can see that they've gone up and then come down, and these are all countries where we've had great difficulties in microfinance. Pretty soon I'll have enough data to add India to this list. I think we'll see the numbers coming down there. In the blog and in the book, I asked the somewhat impertinent question, who inflated those bubbles? In the case of Nicaragua, it was mostly foreigners, all with the best of intentions. Some were public, like CABE, the second one there, and some were private, although they may have been taking public money too, such as Blue Orchard. So, having surveyed the impacts of microfinance through 3 lenses, escape from poverty, freedom, and industry building, I then in the last chapter have to stop just looking at the world through multiple perspectives and synthesize and judge. And I guess I would offer a few sort of summarizing thoughts. And overall, where I see the great strength of microfinance as being is in developing institutions and industries that can deliver inherently useful services to thousands and millions of people. That's the core success. And as I say, I see it as a kind of provision of a kind of infrastructure service. It's not going to change people, it's not going to lift people out of poverty, but it is very useful. And it is a real contribution in many cases to the national economic fabric. The greatest problem for microfinance has been the hype, not only because it's predictably led to a backlash when reality is caught up with the rhetoric, but in the very particular way that hype can feed credit cycles, of boom and bust. That's unique to microfinance or microcredit. And so I see a serious problem now for the industry is that the hype has led to so much excitement that there's too much money going in. And I want to emphasize that while there have been these problems in in 4 or 5 countries, and we may see more, I don't see that as an argument for getting rid of microfinance any more than the recent difficulties in the United States with mortgages are an argument for getting rid of mortgages, right? It's an argument for doing it better because these services are just too indispensable. So to try to draw together these ideas, I offer a couple of principles in the book. One is that we should help microfinance play to its strengths. I've already told you what I think its strength is, and so we should be working to help microfinance institutions contribute more to the economic fabric, avoid overshoot, diversify their service offerings. And we should also try to dodge the trade-offs. In economics, there's a concept of working at the frontier. If you want to offer more services to poorer people, that will come at a higher cost. There are always trade-offs when you're working at the margin. However, over time, technologies can really push back the frontier of what's possible. And one great role for outsiders is to try to support and stimulate the development of these new technologies. The great example now is M-Pesa, the money transfer system in Kenya, which was created in part, it's just absolutely taken off. It was created in part with a challenge grant from DFID, the UK aid agency. 4 more concrete recommendations, and then I'll end. I think we need to discourage efforts to lend to the very poorest people. There's no evidence that the truly indigent can make good use of microcredit. And I think it kind of goes against common sense that we should be putting the poorest people in debt. I don't think we should view credit as a human right and make sure everybody gets it. Yet that principle is currently codified in US law, and I think that should be changed. You won't be surprised to see I want us to move away from credit, which can create the most risk for clients, and move to the extent possible towards deposit taking, insurance, and money transfers. That is in fact happening in many of the mature microfinance markets such as Bangladesh and Bolivia. We should look to technology for creating new possibilities, as I've already suggested. And in general, not necessarily in every country, but in general, we should look to reducing the amount of money that goes into microcredit. I'd rather see microcredit go more slowly, more carefully, than grow too quickly. I look forward to your questions and also to comments from the panel. Thank you for listening. I don't know I guess we should just, oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. So I forgot the order too. We're going to hear next from Rich Rosenberg from CGAP, who is one of the very small pantheon in my mind of great thinkers in this field, and I'm really pleased to have him. He will then moderate the second half of the program.
Thank you, David. First, a word to my colleagues on the panel. We are running well past schedule here, and that confronts us with a resource allocation issue. And I believe that the appropriate decision principle here is devil take the hindmost. So that means that I will try to be very brief, and I encourage you to do that as well. For me, the most remarkable thing about this book is that, having concluded that microfinance doesn't get people out of poverty, that you shouldn't be lending to the poorest, that group methodologies are seriously flawed, and that pro bono and government funders should stop pumping money into microcredit, he gets a glowing endorsement from Muhammad Yunus. And I think this is a testimony to David's ability to really engage in a non-confrontational way, a broad spectrum of the industry. I want to focus on just one point. In chapter 7, David looks at the extent to which microcredit principally improves people's ability to control their lives. To what extent does that happen, and to what extent does it interfere with people's ability to control their lives by getting them into debt traps, et cetera, et cetera? And if I'm reading the book correctly, there's evidence on both sides of that one, especially but not exclusively when it comes to group credit. In chapter 8, David turns to microfinance as industry building and sees a very impressive story there. And somewhere in there says that, absent compelling evidence to the contrary about damage being done, we ought to celebrate the building of this industry. Absent compelling evidence to the contrary. Well, I guess I would agree with that. But the whole game comes down to how much damage is being done. And I think we're in bad shape if we are reduced to answering that, as we are right now. I fully agree. We're reduced to answering that by arguments about the burden of proof. That's an empirical question. How many people are getting into debt traps? I am not myself willing to assume that because it's finance, it's basically good, and it's going to be a surprise if the problems are anything but temporary and limited. And my point of comparison is the payday lending industry in the United States, where we do have empirical evidence that it is systematically getting people into debt traps, and numerous jurisdictions, including the District of Columbia, are considering shutting it down, which I think is exactly what ought to happen. So this is basically, if you ask me to bet, in the long haul, when all the information is in and we're looking back on this 50 years hence, will it look like a good thing? I'm placing my bet the same place that David is, but I am very troubled by the absence of empirical evidence about over-indebtedness, and I wish that we would have 3 studies of that for every impact study that we have. And with that, I will end and introduce, first of all, Martin Holtman. Martin, I believe, probably has the broadest experience of microfinance of any person sitting in this room, given the fact that he spent years managing the delivery of services and further years as an analyst, and now has spent many years managing the delivery of financing as Mr. Microfinance at the IFC. Martin, take it away.
Thanks, Rich, and I'll be short as you asked me to be. So a few comments on the book itself. I have 3 sets of comments. One on the book, another one on my favorite chapters 7 and 8. I'm just one person in a long queue of people who are going to praise those chapters. And finally, a little bit, because I was asked to talk about the role of the public sector. So what's the role of the IFCs of this world, of the as Wendy Abt kept reminding me when I joined IFC, of the elite bureaucrats of this world. So, so first, a few comments on the book. We will make this obligatory reading for IFC's investment staff. I hope to somehow get an electronic version that I can send around. It's a treasure trove of just about anything you would ever want to discuss, at least in this decade, around the topic of microfinance. And I think it's actually great value for money and very light indeed. I received a book a few months ago by Pouch from India, and the thing is 3 kilos. You could actually kill someone with it. I just love the kind of the the ratio of weight to insight in it. I actually consider David to be one of the very few people in industry who have the role of a magician. You may know that there are these leadership archetypes, the sovereign, the lover, the warrior, and the magician. And if you look at the microfinance industry, you find in every corner, you find some of the above. I leave it up to your imagination to classify people. But David, for me, just as a few other people, for instance, Harry Schmidt over in Frankfurt, and actually J.D. von Pischke, the person here with the whitest hair. I'm not talking about Bill Clinton, but J.D. von Pischke, one of my gurus when I came into microfinance. One would read his books. So David, in my view, falls into that category. He helps us understand the big picture while also really doing the deep dive into the issues. So I'm very, very grateful for that, and I think this, in that sense, the book is extremely timely. It gives us a lot of food for thought, and I'll come back to that when I talk about the public sector. A few words about these chapters 7 and 8, and that's really on the industry development. When I read those chapters, it really reminds me of Michael Porter's analysis of how industries are built, how technical expertise creates industry leaders, that creates competition. If you look, for instance, at the leading microfinance greenfielders, they all happen to come from, even in some cases, the same cities, or certainly they've come from the same groups of people. There are suppliers with upstream, downstream, and last but not least, an incredible amount of training going on for staff. If you just think of the hundreds of thousands of people who work in microfinance these days, that's really great. I personally had that story when I worked in a bank. In fact, my first ever job in microfinance was with a little place called Centenary Bank, which in the Ugandan context sounded like a contradiction in terms. Like, how could a bank in Uganda ever be a centenary bank, unless it was Barclays, of course. And so, and that bank is still around, and it's probably one of the strongest institutions in the financial sector there. And for every centenary bank, you find many other microfinance institutions that have played that role. And so I really congratulate you on expressing in words what many of us have felt but were never able to kind of put together as a topic.
Very useful thing to understand what the studies do and do not say, and I think David really tackles that well. But I think he also goes through the complexity of the history of the industry. I think there's lots of debates as to who started microfinance, and I think it's very useful to sort of sort through all that. He also goes through the different methodologies, which often are confusing, and then the evolution of those methodologies. But he also tackles issues like the way products develop, how they've developed, and the economics behind certain products, and why microfinance institutions tend to focus on credit first as a way to get to scale, and why it's much more challenging to then move towards real micro savings, real micro insurance, remittances, payments. Why are those products harder to get to? We've all been saying we want to move there. What stops us? I think he really tackles that. He's got sections on Andhra Pradesh and the crisis of overlending, not just in India, but also in Nicaragua and several places around the world. And to understand the dynamics there are very useful. And also just even the hyperbole itself. David, I think, is very fair in going through in the book. How does that hyperbole come about? Again, I've never actually met anyone who used the phrase microfinance is a silver bullet. And yet, I can tell you just within my own organization, I'm constantly editing our own documents to take out the hyperbole. There are a lot of pressures to simplify things. There are a lot of pressures to overstate things and say people want to solve poverty, so they want to believe. And so just understanding that dynamic is very, very useful as we all try to keep that hyperbole in check. So I think David's blogs and also now the book have made at least me much more sensitive to the overstatement that is very natural in the industry. In the end, I do think that where he comes out happens to work very well and very consistently with Axion's own strategy. The focus on development as industry building, that's a lot of how we see our work. Over the history of Axion, we've built 62 microfinance institutions in 31 countries on 4 continents that today serve millions. And we see, he uses the phrase at one stage, institutional midwifery as one of the virtues of the industry. And I do think that's a lot of our strategy at Axion and a lot of the work of the industry to build institutions. And I do think that is, as compared to some of the other measurements, I think that is unequivocally positive. And from that competition and from that industry building, you do get, and again, it's outlined in the book very well, competition, innovation, lower prices to clients, and ultimately you do make the world a bit of a better place. I certainly agree that we as an industry need to move beyond credit, and we need to focus more on savings, insurance, and payments, and that's part of our strategy as well. So I'll end there. There are a couple of places in the book where I do disagree, and maybe in the Q&A we'll have more time. But in the interest of time, let me just end by saying I think David's voice in his blog and now in his book is a great contribution to the industry. And so I hope that the end of this book doesn't mean that you won't continue both your blog and your voice in the industry. So I think it's a very, very important contribution. So congratulations and thank you.
David, you have any observation you want to make before we...
Only that I paid the price for talking too long, which is I did not get to hear Michael's criticisms.
You may read them on your blog.
Oh, good. Beyond that, I'd rather hear from the audience.
Well, I have a question or two for the panel first. And the biggest one for me is, one's going to take a book like this seriously, one ought to meet some of its central contentions head on. The proposition in the book is that pro bono and governmental international agencies should not be financing the delivery of microcredit. I overstate that very slightly, but you guys are both sort of in the business, and what do you think of that?
I'm happy to start. That was one of the things that I disagree with. I do think, and in fact, actually, I think if it gets simplified to say that we should stop investing public money, then I disagree with that. If you construe it to say we should be a little smarter in how we invest public money and be a little bit more targeted, then I do agree with that. The argument in the book, he talks about 150 million clients being served today, but also there are 2 to 3 billion who are living in poverty and lack financial access to financial services. It's hard to see if we're just the beginning of this movement. There's so much more work to do, and plus the book does a very good job of saying, look, we figured out how to do credit at scale. But I would even argue that there are what are the numbers? There are 122 microfinance institutions who represent 79% of those clients being served, and 13 MFIs represent 48%. I would actually argue that there are very few microfinance institutions that have really reached scale and sustainability, and if we're ever going to get to billions, we need to do more. So I don't think now is the time to be cutting back. That said, I certainly agree that there are places where there is over-lending, there's places where there's bad collection practices, and I think we have to be smarter about how do we target the growth of microfinance institutions to the places that need it better, more, and also how do we push them to focus more on savings and remittances and beyond credit. So I think we can be smarter, and frankly I think some of the public institutions, as Martin described, do exactly that role. How do we make sure they're better governed, I think, is a critical issue. So I think we can be smarter in how we use public money. I don't think we should walk away.
So, Rich, I wonder if we read the same book. Sorry, that was just a cheap shot.
I think that's a cheap shot at the book.
When Idi Amin was once told about this thing, apartheid in South Africa, he said, who is that man? And so I sometimes wonder, who is that private sector, that everybody talks about? And I'm not so sure there is one private sector that is eagerly waiting to jump into anything such as microfinance or any other frontier kind of investment, impact investment. It's a very heterogeneous bunch of players. I'm a little bit, on that one I would actually say I'm not so sure that to classify a Blue Orchard, who I would certainly classify as a private sector player, to classify them as a mixed bag, I'm not so sure about. Same thing for IMI or what is now ProCredit, which by the way was founded in 1998 and not in 1992 as the book says. So little things here, but talking, well, he wanted criticism, right? So you need to give him a little bit. It's like, that in the Arab countries, when a carpet is made in Persia, for instance, they always on purpose put one mistake in because they say only Allah is perfect. So it would be crazy if a book that is as rich as this one did not have a couple of small things in it. So, but seriously, I personally think, first of all, we shouldn't equate public funding for development finance or for any kind of finance with something that's bad. There are whole financial systems in the world that are pretty inclusive. I just mentioned Japan and Germany, that are basically public sector finance. 70% of the deposits in Germany are held by public sector institutions. The Japanese Postal Bank is the largest deposit-taking institution in the world. And I don't think anyone would argue that those systems are not inclusive or don't provide access to finance for ordinary, simple, maybe even poor people. That's my first point about this. The second one is, I usually find, when you come down to the granular level of putting, for instance, a new greenfield institution into an African country like the Congo, that it's always a partnership. And there are private sector players that want to come along and want to move in, including in some cases local private players, increasingly actually. And so I see this more symbiotic than an antagonism. And so the proof then, of course, that we need to deliver of our usefulness is that at some point we fade away. Maybe like the color on this pen at some point will go away. And I could give you a couple of examples where we're actually exiting. We're finding that in some of our international investments with holding companies, for instance, that there's now sufficient private sector interest, some pension funds, some other investors that want to come in, and we will happily sell them our stakes. And in fact, we did that in several cases already. So, and on that one, and I agree with David that that needs to be better documented, that there ought to be more transparency about that in the business. So on that one, I would say let's keep this book going with the blog, of course, and check every couple of years on how we're all doing. But my main point is I don't think there is an antagonistic relationship here. I think it can be very symbiotic.